What's up, musicologists? Welcome to Amari Music Talk. I'm Richard Cole, and today we're going to talk about the blueprint for Funkadelic. All right, so if you are new to the channel, welcome. If you're a longtime listener, welcome back. And today, the blueprint of Funkadelic. I'm going to talk about the three key albums that influenced George Clinton to create the concept for Funkadelic. All right, so we know Funkadelic originally started off as the Parliaments, and they were like a five-man vocal group, no different than the Temptations or the Four Tops of the Dramatics and all the other, great singing groups of that era. Initially, they were signed to Motown, and if you're familiar with the dynamics of Motown Records, there's so many legends that have come out of that. Temptations, Four Tops, the Supremes, Jackson 5, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, Marvelettes, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas. And the list just goes on and on. Marvin Gaye, it just goes on and on. But because there were so many different acts trying to get on, and the competition was fierce, not only amongst the artists, but the different producers and songwriters. You had that core studio band, the Funk Brothers, just creating great music throughout the 60s and 70s. But, there were also, I would say, maybe not lesser groups, but like I said, the competition was so fierce, then, you could only get like the Contours with Do You Love Me, or the Originals with Baby I'm For Real, Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, Does Your Mama Know About Me? Those, great classic tracks. But like I said, when you got that assembly line of writers and producers, artists, all jockeying for position for hits. Here you have the Parliaments, like I say, waiting for their shot to get on, and coming up with record after record, and nothing really catching on until George Clinton comes up with the song Testify. And that became a pretty big hit for the Parliaments. But again, great hit, but how could they set themselves apart from all these other great groups? Again, Contours, Temptations, Four Tops, all these other groups, how can they stand apart? And as we come into the year of 1967, as three albums, and I would say three albums that changed, I would say, not only Black music, but music in general. And I'm going to talk about those three albums. These were albums that George Clinton, once he heard them for the first time way back in 1967, it gave him the idea like, oh, okay, now I know what to do to set the group apart. Another ingredient to this too, due to some contractual situations, they lost the name for the Parliaments for quite a long time. So they had to come up with another name. So we'll get into that a little bit later. But I'm going to start off with probably the first album that comes to mind, or the first album that influenced George Clinton, is Sly and the Family Stone's A Whole New Thing. And this album, originally, it's their debut album. And this album is kind of what's known as a musician's album, meaning that like when this album dropped, it didn't catch fire. It's a great album. I recommend everybody check it out. A lot of people think the Dance to the Music was Sly and the Family Stone's first album, only because Dance to the Music was the big hit and it was Sly's first major hit. But there's a lot of funk. There's a lot of stuff going on A Whole New Thing. A lot of it has been sampled. If you check out the documentary Sly Lives, They kind of touch on that and also give some examples. Probably the most famous is LL Cool J's Mama Said Knock You Out, uses that sample from Sly and the Family Stone's Trip to Your Heart. But it's one of my favorite albums. When I heard it for the first time, I got it. But again, like I said, this wasn't a major hit, but again, it's a musician's album. And you talk to musicians, if they're familiar with it, they'll go on and on all day about it. But like I said, George heard it and was heavily influenced by that. And there's a lot of elements that you will hear, especially in the early Funkadelic albums, the Westbound era stuff, borrows heavily from this and a lot of Sly's albums. Sly, to me, I think two of the greatest musicians albums, this one, and there's a riot going on. But again, it's 1967. Here's a whole new thing. George Clinton hears it and is hyped. He's hyped. And it kind of brings me to, well, actually, I want to talk more about a whole new thing because, like I said, it's one of my favorite Sly and the Family Stone albums. I've got just about all of their classic ones on CD and a few on vinyl. And like I said, I love the sound because it has everything in a blender. It's got the Stax sound. It's got a little bit of the Motown flavor. It's got, you know, Beatlesque stuff going on. The lyrics, we don't talk about Sly's lyrics enough. The cleverness in a lot of his lyrics, especially, check out tracks like Underdog. Trip to Your Heart is one that comes to mind. Let's see, I'm trying to think, was this on? Because Dance to the Music, that album, it's kind of like a whole new thing, but just a tad more commercial, but no less funky. Underdog, If This Room Could Talk. Let's see, I Cannot Make It, I'm So Hip. Trip to Your Heart. Let's see. Let Me Hear It From You. It's a nice ballad. Turn Me Loose. Like I said, very Stax oriented. And like I said, coming out the box, great musicianship. Sly and the Family Stone, they are definitely on the one on this one. So if you haven't heard it, by all means, check it out. It's on streaming. You could get the CD. I think you can still get the vinyl. But by all means, definitely check that one out. So Sly and the Family Stone, whole new thing. All right. So the next album I want to talk about is Jimi Hendrix, or should I say the Jimi Hendrix Experience, with their debut album, Are You Experienced? And like I said, where I think Sly's album, the musician's album, I think with Jimi Hendrix, we think how he revolutionized the guitar. I think his recording, even though he had like Eddie Kramer, he had Chaz Chandler, I think he is from formerly of the Animals, became Jimmy's producer, especially the first, the Are You Experienced, Axis Bold as Love, and Electric Ladyland. But the production, but a lot of it was things that Jimmy was hearing in his own head. And let's not forget the importance of his engineer, Eddie Kramer, because I think really more so, yeah, Chaz Chandler kind of provided the discipline and the focus especially for the first few albums, but the combination of Jimi Hendrix and Eddie Kramer, I mean, the sounds, can either go toe to toe, stand up to, rival, and in some cases, even better, the Beatles in that. Because Are You Experienced plus the next album I'm going to talk about were kind of recorded roughly about the same time. I think Jimmy got out the box first with his album. But like I said, that whole cultural exchange of the 60s, where everybody was influencing everybody, and I think where this whole division of black and white, as far as like the music, especially in that time period, and maybe a little bit into the 70s, yeah, that sort of segregation, maybe the record companies to a point, as corporations started to infiltrate the radio stations. I think, that's another thing. And then just probably based on the region or area that you come from, um, sometimes what your friends think or what people you kind of overhear think kind of maybe influences your decision to get into something or not get into it. But I think that again, like I said, Jimi Hendrix, the Are You Experienced album, I first heard it in college. And well, actually, let's go back. The early part of college, the first Jimi Hendrix song I heard that wasn't Purple Haze was Red House. And that was the song that made me want to take that deeper dive. It was just kind of like taking it for granted at first, like, oh, Jimi Hendrix, oh, Star Spangled Banner at Woodstock. Oh, Purple Haze. Okay, yep, he's great. Yep, and just took it for granted. But to hear that the blues and the way he's playing it on Red House, that made me want to take the deeper dive. So when I first heard the album Are You Experienced, which has Purple Haze, which has Red House on it, I was like, wow, this is it. And I had been a big Beatles fan long before I heard Jimi Hendrix, and just to hear the sounds, things going backwards, what he's doing with the guitar, all the different effects and the sounds, and a lot of the songs are blues based. But then there's a lot that, like I said, you kind of get into that psychedelic, that kind of rock phase. But then there's a nice ballad. The Wind Cries Mary, just the versatility and the creativity on that album, it's just mind blowing. So again, that's the second album where George Clinton heard that and was like, oh, wow, things are going in a whole different direction. This is different than what's going on at Motown. And it's different from the kind of doo-wop style stand groups, that George Clinton was trying to emulate at the time. So again, that's another one. I definitely recommend you check it out. Um, Shout out to the Hendrix estate. Shout out to Janie Hendrix, doing a great job at keeping those albums out in the forefront, and just what she's doing with the Hendrix legacy altogether. Also, if you get a chance, by the time this airs, actually my Jimi Hendrix review of the Electric Lady sessions and the documentary that's accompanying that should be up on YouTube. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, check it out. All right. So now we come to number three, the third key album that influenced George Clinton to come up with Funkadelic is the Beatles' Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. All right, so for me, so we're talking 70s, we're talking 1976. My gateway in the Beatles was this compilation called Rock and Roll Music. And it had just basically all of their rock bass material, whether it was stuff that they wrote, whether it was the covers that they've done. And that was my gateway. And as I started to explore more and more about their story and what they were about, got a book that, and kind of compared to other stuff that we've gotten since, kind of pales, but as a fond memory for me having that book, like I said, I learned about their original UK albums versus what Capitol Records was doing, chopping up their albums and trying to, cash grab right and left, half of their career. But but reading and learning about things like Sergeant Pepper. And then by the time I did get this book, Revolver was my first real Beatles album. And I was already blown away by that. So by the time I hit 13, that year I got Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and listened to that. And again, was just as equally as blown away. As thing about history, when you got future generations, like I'm a second generation Beatles fan, a second generation Hendrix fan, a kind of maybe 1.5 generation Sly and the Family Stone, because they were still active, as I was aware of them. So, when you have future generations and everything is laid out there, so everything that is capitalized on the foundation, that's what they're used to. So other stuff becomes like either ancient history or they can't connect the dots. Or a lot of people have trouble connecting the dots on, oh, well, this was relevant because look at what was going on before then and what you have now. So when I listen to Revolver or when I listen to Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, I see that trajectory, because it's like, yeah, nowadays it's gone back to the single. Yeah, people still talk about albums. People still get excited. Say, like, if the new Kendrick Lamar album drops, people get excited about the album and want to hear the album. But I think now it's really gone back to singles, just the single. You could drop a single, or even EPs have come back. You can do an EP, just 4 songs, and people get excited about that more than the album as a concept. And before 1966, 1967, people didn't, albums were more like a luxury. I don't know what you could compare it to now, since everything is so accessible. But I would say, like, I don't know what you could compare. Maybe a sound bar, Dolby Atmos sound bar. If a lot of people do have them, but it's still kind of like that luxury thing. A home theater experience in your home is still kind of a luxury type of a thing. And that's how it was with albums. Albums were kind of like a luxury. And not only were they a luxury, a lot of people didn't put a lot of thought. Maybe jazz musicians per se, maybe you could say that they were more album oriented. But if you take something like a Frank Sinatra or Nat King Cole, if they had great albums, it was because just that sequence of songs just magically flow together. And when you get into the realm of more pop, when you get into the realm of more, like, especially early rock and roll, it was singles. So nobody thought about albums. And again, if you have something as far as like early rock, Elvis's first album, it's just because the sequence of songs flow. If you talk about uh, like James Brown, again, singles, you have to go like into the 70s with the Payback to say that was an album. Or maybe Black Caesar, because it was a soundtrack album. You could think of James as an album artist, but his thing was always singles, 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 singles. But yeah, it's because of Revolver, it's because of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, that the thought about the album as a piece of art, or an album that you think about as a total concept, maybe not necessarily like sort of like a lot of prog rock. It's like a telling of a Greek myth half the time, but just thinking about it conceptually, even fast forward to Michael Jackson conceptualizing Thriller. But here's the thing, it's Michael Jackson conceptualizing an album where every single song is a hit single on it. And I think in the end, maybe not until history that he thought of the album as a concept, instead of trying to duplicate the process. Like maybe Bad would have been better off had it been a different type of a concept, but I'm digressing. But with Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you see that kind of door open up to where you can have a what's going on, to where you can have Stevie Wonder's entire 70s output. So it's no longer thinking about an album like, okay, well, let me stick a couple of hit singles on it, and well, just to fill out the album, just whatever we throw in the album. If it works, it works. But people are going to buy it just for the two hit singles. That kind of stopped in 1966 and 1967. Like I said, probably with the exception of jazz albums or classical albums or something, soundtracks, movie soundtracks, Broadway soundtracks. Pop music didn't think of albums like that except to sell to a niche market. Like I said, it was a luxury. And like stereo, believe it or not, for all you younger folks, that was a luxury. Other than that, everybody had their one speaker. But then again, haven't we gone back to that one speaker with our phones? All right. So Sergeant Pepper, like I said, I enjoyed it when I first heard it. And again, there's the techniques, like a lot of these things from especially Revolver and Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the stuff that Jimi Hendrix was doing with Are You Experienced, Axis Bold as Love. Now we have the computers, where you can get an MPC and you can sample different sounds and loop things, where before, it is kind of like ancient history now, to where you make a sound, or if you want to make a loop, you literally had to cut tape and you had to loop it, or you had to splice it together in a certain way to get the effect. You had to play the thing backwards. You don't press a button and things go in reverse, or you don't press a button and you get a reverse gate, reverb, or digital delay. Everything was out of the box thinking for then. So, like I said, where we take it for granted now to where we can get on our computers and do stuff, then, back then it was more of an art form. It was literally making art, and in an avant-garde way, like I said, cutting up tape, the use of the Leslie speakers and things like that, the different effects. Flanging was something that was invented. If it wasn't on Revolver, I want to say maybe the Paperback Writers, but again, flanging, something we take for granted. Phasing, something we take for granted because now we can push a button and do it. Back then, you had to put some thought into how to get that sound in there. And so really, it was Sergeant Pepper was like doubling down on some of the out of the box thinking of Revolver. And again, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band is another album that George Clinton heard it and said, okay, this is what I want to do now. So with those three albums, it's like, okay, well, what we're going to do, we're going to ditch the matching suits, the matching shark skin suits and ties. It's like we're going to come out, we're going to wear whatever we want, whether it's hippie inspired, whether, it's George Clinton coming out with just a sheet on and stuff, because they were like, hey, the suits, you got to clean them every night on tour, and it's just a pain, it's like, you got to worry about keeping them clean, your shoes shine and stuff. George Clinton was like, nah, this is what we're going to do. We just going to do this. And because they couldn't use the name Parliaments, so they said, well, we'll flip it. We're going to keep the vocal group, but we're going to shift the focus to the musicians. So now you have, your Eddie Hazels and your Billy Bass Nelsons in there. And the band, they're holding it down. So the focus became on that because when you look at Sly and the Family Stone, that was probably one of the, outside of, I would say more so in Black music, because you had it all the time with the rock groups, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, the Kinks, whoever. They were all self-contained bands. But for an R&B group, you didn't have that dynamic. You either, Booker T and the MGs might be the closest, but they didn't really sing. They're more of an instrumental ensemble. But with Sly and the Family Stone, you had a band, a true bona fide band, men and women, black and white. And the world, again, we take it for granted because, you fast forward some 20 some odd years later, 20, 25 years later, then you get Prince and the Revolution. So here you got George Clinton looking at Sly and the Family Stone. It's a self-contained band. The Beatles are a self-contained band. Jimi Hendrix, even though he was the front man, you had the experience. You had the drummer, Mitch Mitchell, and then you had the bass player, in there as well. So looking at that, it's like, okay, well, we'll shift the focus onto the band. And, I think in a way it really freed the creativity, good thing we have like George Clinton as an out-of-the-box thinker. And then years later meeting Bootsy Collins, another, out-of-the-box thinker that was influenced by those same sounds. And in addition to that, the having been in the master class of being in James Brown's band, that out-of-the-box thinking is one of the most important ingredients for funk. It's not only the musicianship, but I mean the lyrics, how Sly and the Family or Sly Stone was clever writing lyrics, where you had Lennon and McCartney, but I would say with the more wordplay, Lennon kind of with the more storytelling aspects of things, McCartney. You got Jimi Hendrix, who was heavily influenced by Bob Dylan, and again, connecting, Funkadelic or Parliament Funkadelic. You had Jimmy, who was an avid science fiction reader as well, So now here you got George Clinton coming up with the mothership and things like that. So, I mean, it's so many, like I said, dots to connect just off of those three albums. And like I said, I recommend you check out each and every one. But what do you think? Are any one of those albums your favorite? Shout out your favorite in the comments. Do you love all three like I do? And also shout out your favorite Funkadelic album. We got there's so many, but that's going to be another episode. I'll do a little deeper dive more into George Clinton and Parliament Funkadelic in the next episode as well. But leave me a comment, let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, hit the notification bell. If you are on Patreon, become a Patreon supporter. Get early access to episodes, plus exclusive bonus content to the channel. You also get to come up with your own topic. And on top of that, you also get some shout outs in the videos that are exclusive to the channel. So until next episode, create your day, create your life. Yeesh.